Hey, all you wiretappers out there. I'm back here in Studio Gangland Wire. This is Gary Jenkins, retired Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit detective, sergeant at the end. I want to tell you about Cork Civella. I get a lot of guys commenting, "Hey, they want to know more about Kansas City," and I've done a little bit, and I've got some old stuff on Nick Civella, but it's like several years old, and it's not even on YouTube. I don't think and I don't even know if you can find it on the audio app. I need to go get that out and re-edit it and put it up. But I've never really done Cork, and Cork is an interesting guy. Carl Cork Civella, born in 1910. Their father, he and Nick Civella, whose older brother, will become the mob bosses of Kansas City, and Nick will be more the major domo, if you will, the main mob boss. But Cork was right in there with him, as you're going to find out. Now, it's Cork, as I was told, not Corky. He's named Cork because he pops off. I'll give you a pretty good example of that. He sometimes acts without thinking. They were the sons of a Sicilian immigrant in Kansas City, as you might well imagine. They grew up in what we call the North End, or Little Italy. Now, this area is anchored by the Holy Rosary Catholic Church at 911 Missouri Street. It's like this big church, and the Holy Rosary Church has always brought immigrants in and helped them learn English and get jobs. They still do that to this day. The Don Bosco Center, when the Vietnamese first started coming over after the war, they came to the Holy Rosary Church and the Don Bosco Center, where they learned English, and they started moving into Little Italy. I mean, they were Catholic for the most part, and they took over a lot of Little Italy as this area changed. And the area looks like kind of like New York to me. It doesn't look like anything else in Kansas City. It has this real big city look to it. These boys, Nick and Carl Civella, and they took the same path as a lot of immigrant children and a lot of the mob bosses and mob people I've talked about in every city of the United States. Their father actually was a pushcart peddler, I believe, and small businesses, and because mainly newly arrived immigrants that didn't speak English couldn't really get jobs in the United States. So they had to figure out, start a restaurant or a push cart, sell fruit on the street, whatever they could do, had to start their own business for the most part. And so their father had a small business, and the boys took the same path as a lot of immigrant children. And like I said, all these mob guys I've talked about before, they left school early. They formed a small gang. One of the things they got into was narcotics. They got into narcotics too, but first they got into tire theft. That was a big thing. They were tire thieves, and there was several mob guys that had outlets out there, so they could steal the tires, go out into the suburbs, if you will, over into downtown, and steal tires and bring them back and sell them through these Black Hand, at the time, associated outlets. Their father supposedly was victimized by the Black Hand, which will maybe explain why this little gang led by Nick and Cork got into robbing some mafia protected games. Cork did take a bust. He took a pinch and an arrest, and I don't think he got a conviction for possession of heroin in the 1930s. The mob was getting heroin out of Cuba to Tampa up to Kansas City, and we had a regular trade going. They kind of got out of it later on in life, but he did take a pinch for that. Now, the Civella gang will graduate from tire theft to armed robbery, and that's when they started getting in trouble. A lucrative place to rob that isn't going to complain much, you don't have to worry about the cops, are gambling games. There's gambling games all around. Some of them protected, some of them aren't. And that's where they first got in trouble, was robbing some protected gambling games, because Nick was always his own guy. He was never going to buckle down, buckle under to the old mustache Pete's. They tried to actually recruit his gang to do stuff for them, but again, he was his own guy. He always was. He was smarter than the average bear in this world, and he always remained smarter than the average bear in this world. Finally, in 1940, somebody gunned down a Civella gang member named Jake Maroon. Now, years later, his son or grandson, Bobby Maroon, will become the caretaker of the trap or the social club. But gunned down Jake Maroon in an alley right behind the Northview Social Club or the trap at 5th and Truth, which is in Little Italy. Nick will flee to Chicago. At the time, Corky will just lay low. Corky, I shouldn't call him Corky. He might get mad at me. Cork will just lay low. Somehow a peace deal got brokered. Nick was able to come back, and they were able to come back to Little Italy. But everybody didn't really agree to this peace deal. I think there was a guy named Big Jim Ballesteri who didn't agree to it. I believe he was the one. We go through the war, as most mob histories are really incomplete during the war, because a lot of guys took off and went to war, were drafted, and everything was really in disarray during the war. After the war, January 1946, a guy who was a long-time member of the Civella gang named Joe Buggy Anch was gunned down in Little Italy at, I believe, 8th and Lydia, just east of Little Italy a little bit. A few days later, 8 days later, I believe, Nick Civella and a Jackson County deputy sheriff named Quay were sitting in Nick Civella's car in the parking lot of a liquor store just a few blocks south of Little Italy at 15th Street. And Little Italy really stops about 7th Street. And two gunmen pull up in the car. They jump out. One's got a shotgun, one's got an actual machine gun, and they start filling that car full of lead. Well, Nick is sitting in the passenger seat, and the deputy sheriff has got in the driver's seat for whatever reason. They kill the deputy. Nick rolls out and takes off running, and he goes back to Chicago. During these times, he really established good connections in Chicago. They seem to like him up there. They say Cherry Nose Joey was kind of his mentor. Others will say when he comes back from Chicago this next time, and Chicago actually brokers the deal. The story goes that Tony Accardo talked to the new boss in Kansas City in the late 40s, Tony Gizzo, and paved the way for Nick to come back. We know he came back in 1948 because he was arrested for gambling. Pretty soon, it's noticed that Nick is now Tony Gizzo's driver. So whatever, however this worked out, nobody knows for sure. He comes back a reasonably important guy because he's now the driver for the boss. And it's really Tony Gizzo will die in 1953. They'll have the murder of the two Charlies. Charlie Menaggio was kind of the boss. He was a politician / boss. Gizzo was more of a gambler and the boss. But he dies in 1953. Menaggio's gone, and it's believed that probably that's when Nick Civella, a pretty young guy, started moving on in. By 1957, Nick Civella, and there's an old Prohibition-era Sicilian mobster named Joe Filardo, who never really wanted to be the boss, but had been kind of on the ruling council, if you will, of Tano Lococo and Joe Filardo and a couple others who lived on into older age. Anyhow, Joe Filardo and Nick Civella are on a train on their way to the Appalachian Convention in upstate New York at Barber's place. And they're caught by the police. And supposedly Nick Civella said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, we're looking for girls." Some people think that Filardo was taking Nick to the Appalachian meeting to introduce him as the new boss of Kansas City. I know there's another guy who's kind of an expert on this. Bill Owsley is a retired FBI agent who was boss of the one squad for a long time and was the main agent that worked on the mob in Kansas City for his whole career, basically. He has a story that maybe Sam Giancana knew Nick Civella from his days in Chicago. Giancana wanted some more influence for out west, and he was going to propose that Nick Civella get a seat on the commission along with Chicago. Now, I don't know. A lot of people would argue with that, and a lot of people like to say that Chicago's, they would never share anything like that, but I don't know. You never know. He's smart. He expands his crime family's influence into politics. He meets Roy Lee Williams, who's a local Teamster boss, and who will go on to be, he eventually will, just before he dies, become the international president. He meets him on a Jackson County committee to decide on who runs for office and who doesn't. So Nick, his brother Cork, we're talking about Cork, Cork stays at his side, but as an enforcer. Cork is not the kind of guy that you can put on this kind of a commission. He's not that guy. He's the guy you want for the street. He never really took on the official role of underboss or consigliere. He was always referred to as a brother. Eventually, he'll be known. You could call him the street boss, I would say, because he always spoke for Nick and he carried out Nick's directions. And people, when he spoke, they thought they were he was speaking for Nick. And some of his early things is we had a couple of mob soldiers named Felix Farina and Tiger Cardarella. They were charged with the attempted murder of a government witness in 1960. They needed an alibi. So Cork's a guy that goes out on the street. See, Nick was never the guy that went out and talked to people directly that weren't, like made guys or right next to him. He hits the streets. He finds a gambler that owes money. And he tells him he'll forgive $5,000 in gambling debts for the guy if he'll give the two hitmen an alibi, and he does that. Another thing he did, and this was 1960 and 1959, the mob-dominated Teamsters, Local 774, made a move to take over the Kansas City Fire Department and take away the firemen from the International Association of Firefighters. The IAFF Union president was a real feisty battalion captain named Stanton Gladden, and he resisted. But politics was all infused in the fire department, especially back then. Politically appointed fire chief offered a promotion to Stanton Gladden if he would support moving the IAFF out and the Teamsters in. Well, he was the president of the IAFF, and he was not going to do that. He tried to get another lower-ranking fireman and offered him a promotion to help with this, and Stanton Gladden learned about this, and he exposed it to the media. And it's all in the newspapers now. Cork is given the job to intercede. He offers Stanton Gladden the job of fire chief, and he said the current chief will become known as the director of the fire department. E.F. Gladden will drop his resistance to the Teamsters move. Gladden again refuses. And over the next few months, a mob-controlled politician will offer Gladden another promotion within the fire department if he'll back off a little bit. He won't do it. And finally, somebody put a bomb in his car, and he was severely injured out of that bomb. But the Teamsters never took over the IAFF or the Kansas City Fire Department. Another thing tells you a little bit about Cork. In 1960, we had a grand jury in Kansas City, and Nick and Cork were both waiting in the hallway. And there's a lot of newsmen down at the other end of the hallway, and somebody snapped a photo, and Nick berated him, hey, leave us alone, we're just businessmen. Cork threatened him. He actually threatened him, and then he exposed himself. He shook his dick at him. He got arrested for indecent exposure. That was Cork. Explosive and impulsive at the same time. During this time, the official underboss was Thomas Highway Simone. He died in 1968, and again, like I said, Cork was not named the underboss. He was always the same as Nick, but on the street. He was the street boss. He always spoke for him on the street. See, Nick Civella was not a street guy who was out in the joints. I never saw him out in the joint. You hardly ever saw him out in just a few places. Cork was out every night in the joints. He was running around to different businesses. He was down to City Market every day, at DeFeo's or hung around that particular area where people could find him. I know a guy whose father-in-law was a bondsman and politically connected in Kansas City, Kansas. And he told me that his father-in-law came over about at least once a week just to see Cork and talk to him. I asked him, I said, do you think Cork ran everything, street stuff in KCK? And he said, yeah, he probably did. Not so much in Missouri, but in KCK definitely did, because there was other members of the Willie Combisano, had a lot of stolen property, fencing outlets going and different, had a crew going here that were really good burglars and thieves. He had to have his action. I think KCK was strictly for Cork. And we'll see a little more evidence of that later on. Nick he might make a sporadic visit to the market, but didn't hang around down there. It was not a regular place. He did go to his lawyer's office regularly, and he used that space, and he discussed business with Tuffy, and made and received telephone calls out of the lawyer's office. I noticed I don't ever remember seeing Cork down there, and I don't remember any of the wiretaps or the bugs mentioning that Cork was there. And there was mainly, this was during the Las Vegas casino time. So Cork was not, he was kind of involved in that, but not near as much as Tuffy and Nick were the ones that were really involved in the Las Vegas casino business and skimming from casinos and making those decisions and dealing with the people in Las Vegas and in Chicago too. Cork did maintain close ties with corrupt politicians and law enforcement in KCK, like I said. He will attempt to organize and control several Kansas side strip clubs. There's one guy named Vance Anderson had a pretty successful club over there called the Red Apple. And one time Cork he had these two career criminals, Mike Ruffalo and Gene Shepard, working for him. He told them to take a stick of dynamite and put it under Anderson's Cadillac and detonate it out in the parking lot of the Red Apple. Then later on, he went over to see Anderson. He said, you got some problems, these young guys, I can help you out here, but you got to bring me in here. And he wanted a piece of the clubs when he wanted. And what's interesting, I noticed that over the next year or so, Anderson started making some moves to partner up and buy other Kansas side strip clubs. So, none of that ever really came out. Kind of an unusual situation with Cork out of that. At the Red Apple, he started dating a young stripper, and I remember her, she was beautiful. And he was like, he was old at the time. He was probably in his 60s, I'm like 78, but he seemed old. He had this white wig he wore all the time, and he's a real dapper dresser, if you've seen any of the pictures on the internet. And he always drove a Lincoln Continental, he had a salmon-colored one for a long time, and he traded it for a kind of lime green Lincoln Continental. He didn't have the black or the white or the gray. He had salmon-colored, and then he had lime green. Anyhow, he dated this Antoinette Lanfranca, who worked at the Red Apple. Some people say she was a manager over there. Some people say she was a stripper. I don't know. I remember her over there, and I remember following her around a little bit because she started dating another mobster named Carl Sparrow, who will become in a full-fledged war with him, Carl Sparrow and his brothers, and Cork and Nick Civella and Tuffy DeLuna and the Civella family. So go figure out. Another thing about Cork, he had moved in on a gambler named Al Brandemeyer, which was interesting. I ran into this guy. He said his name was Brandemeyer recently, and I said, was your grandfather have a meat market? Oh, yeah. I said, well, what was the deal? Oh, he was a big gambler and a lot of stories about Grandpa Al, but he didn't really tell me too much. But he had like fresh meat distributors. They bought meat on the hook and had it butchered, and they butchered it in there and supplied restaurants and other small stores and things like that. And then pretty soon, he lost a lot of money in gambling, and he was a bookie too with them. It became the Brandemeyer Meat Company became the B&C Meat Company, or the Brandemeyer and Civella Meat Company. Corky was a salesman. He'd make the rounds of the restaurants as kind of a cover job. And, I know he was once overheard on a bug. They tried to get a bug on him. He was complaining about the business, and he told other salesmen, get out to all the Goombas joints. And he named off a couple of periphery guys who were Italian. And he said, they'll buy from us. Another story about Cork is he was talking, there was a newly developed entertainment district called the River Quay. It was right next to City Market. That's a whole nother story on that. Get my movie Gangland Wire and you'll get that whole story. But there's a young restaurant owner named David Bonadonna, or Freddie Bonadonna. His dad was David Bonadonna, who was probably a made guy, a professional criminal, a low-ranking soldier in a crew for one of the other made guys, Willie Comisano. Cork was in Freddie's joint. He put a new joint in this River Quay area, this newly developed entertainment district. And Corky was running him down, ragging on him, saying, you're stupid. You had a good joint down on the boulevard. He had a nice place down on Southwest Boulevard. You're stupid to move down here. And, Freddie says, well, whatever. Well, within a year, that place is immensely successful. The River Quay was hopping. It was the place to be. And this young guy, Freddie Bonadonna, sees Cork comes in to sell him some more meat because he's got a restaurant. And he said, well, Cork, he says, we're doing okay. He said, I don't think you really knew what you were talking about. Cork said, yeah, how much you making? Freddie, probably a mistake. He said, oh, about 10 grand a month. No, he wasn't making that 10 grand a month. But he said, oh, about 10 grand a month. He wasn't making that kind of money, but Civella believed it and he wanted in on the action, but he couldn't really move in on Freddie because Freddie's father, David, was with another guy named Willie Comisano. That will go spin off into another deal. Comisano wants a piece of Freddie's action, and he ends up killing David. Like I said, that's a whole nother story about the River Quay and the Comisanos. I have to do Willie Comisano one of these days. Cork had another plan. There's a longtime mobster named Paul Scola, Paulie the Pig. The Scolas all had the moniker of the Pig. The first one was Sammy Scola, or Sammy Hogg, and he was killed I did the story about the murder of Anton Ferris when the sheriff of Jackson County interrupted this hit that was going down and arrested Charlie Mad Dog Gargata right in the act of killing this guy. And Sammy Scola, Paulie's grandpa, was driving a car, and the sheriff shot and killed him right away. As soon as he pulled up, he jumped out and he shot the dude sitting. He was a wheelman, shot him sitting behind the car. I know his great grandson, and he is still not happy about the cops shooting the great grandpa Sammy Hogg. Anyhow, Paulie started coming into Freddie's and butting up to Freddie and said, I want to start a restaurant down here. And they both kind of had Freddie has thinking about expanding. He had his eyes set on a place about the end of the block. He was like 3rd and Delaware and down at 4th and Delaware. Freddie kind of had his eyes set on this other place because he could put another joint down there. And this guy knew it was open and he was wanting to put it down there. He's hanging out down there. And Freddie's dad, this is before he got killed, he encourages Freddie to help Scola. Hey, help this guy out. Paulie ends up getting that lease first, and he opens up a restaurant and bar, and he copies directly Bonadonna's menu and takes several key employees. And Freddie goes, oh, well, I see what that was all about now. Cork Civella becomes a regular down to Scola's place, which means, Scola's with Cork. And several other mobsters, like a guy named Johnny Green Amaro, who was Cork's neighbor up in the neighborhood, and Nick Civella's neighbor, was hanging out. He was a made guy and a professional criminal in his own right. The name of the joint, Delaware Daddies. A little story about Delaware Daddies. And this is, like I said, I tell the story because this has to be Cork's joint. It turns into a strip club, of course, and Cork likes those strip clubs, so he can make money out of them. River Quay's lost its popularity. The families aren't coming down. The young couples, the regular people aren't coming down, and there's some strip clubs opening up. So he turns it into a strip club, and he gets his used car manager. I think I won't say what the guy's name is because I'm not real sure. Anyhow, he's a used car guy, and he becomes the manager. And he gets a local biker gang who he knew from his old used car gig where he used to be a salesman at. He gets a local biker gang to provide the strippers. I remember going in there and they're all gagged up over the corner, and gal would get up and strip, and then she'd go back and sit down with the strippers. This was before they did the lap dances and all that. And these girls started stripping down to nothing. And this was totally verboten or forbidden at the time. Word gets around and a line forms and we hear about it. So I got the job. I get to go down there and I stand in line. And it's about 15 minutes down the line, and the manager's there, and he's talking to everybody, and he's not taking even $1 cover charge. If he'd taken even $1 each, he would have made $1,000 a night, I think, because people were coming and going all night long. What he did was each person who came through, he asked, "Are you with law enforcement?" Like, what the WTF? But no, I work for the city. Well, what do you do? I'm in pollution control. Oh, okay. So go on in. They did strip totally. They even had a couple that would simulate sex late at night. Oh, it was wild. It was crazy. I remember this one night, this guy in the crowd, they're all hooting and hollering, pushing up around the stage, watching these people act like they're getting it on. This one guy says, "Man, you didn't even get it hard." This dude, they're getting done. He's putting his clothes on. He said, "Man," he said, "you get up here, see what you can do." The guy shut up then. Raided the joint a few days later, arrested this manager and several strippers. And, for some reason, they never even reopened. They just let it go after that. They kind of reopened, but they didn't, and this never took off again. They didn't have the same panache, I guess, and it didn't last very much longer. I think they'd made their money. Well, this is during the middle 1970s. Nick has gone back to prison from an old gambling conviction. He's also gotten sick with cancer, so he's not really, he's still running things, and you can hear him in the prison. They got some wiretaps, some bugs. He's still like sending messages out. Nick's going up, or Cork's going up there and kind of, running things by him. And we see Cork regularly at the trap of the city market, and to the casual observer, Cork is now the boss, but Nick is still the boss. Trust me, Nick is still the boss. Well, the Al Brandemeyer and B&C Meat Companies, they've changed it to Mohawk Meat Company to take the Civella name out of there so people won't get nervous about doing business with them. Now we go into some whole nother deal. This really gets wild in Kansas City. Somebody put a bomb on the back door of the trap or the social club just to send a message. There's a guy named Carl Sparrow. His oldest brother has been killed, probably by the Civellas. They had to approve it. They had to approve of Nick Sparrow getting killed. Carl's been in the penitentiary. See my movie, Brothers Against Brothers, for more on that. Carl Sparrow sends a guy named Leonard Crago, who's a bad, bad, bad man, to rob the Mohawk Meat Company and intimidate Al Brandemeyer, which he does. Puts him in the trunk of his car, and he fires several rounds in there and says, "Tell Nick Civella the Arab's back in town." He was the Arab, and everybody knew by now who the Arab was. He was with the Sparrows. Shortly after that, somebody kidnaps a Sparrow associate named Johnny Brocado. He's tortured, and when his body's found, the contents of his stomach are still frozen. Meat market frozen, I don't know. A Civella family member named Johnny Green Amaro, I mentioned him before, was hanging out down there at the Delaware Daddies. He's gunned down his home, which is only a block from Cork and Nick's house. It was a slap in the face of the Civella. That was just getting wild. A young thief who was a friend of Carl Sparrow's and a friend of Freddie Bonadonna's, he's bragging that he's the one that did it, and they killed Sonny Bowen a few days later. End up killing his partner, a guy that's kind of his regular ball partner, rap partner, rides with him all the time, Gary T. Parker. They suspect Freddie's being part of it because his father's been killed because Freddie wouldn't agree with some other things. Like I said, you need to watch that Gangland Wire movie, and it'll tell you a lot more about that. Freddie takes off to witness protection. Cork kind of tries to draw Carl Sparrow in and pacify him, but he's still out for blood. Another thing Cork did during this time, he oversaw a scam of government money. I bet Nick put this together, and that he's in penitentiary when this really is going down. There was a government program called CETA. I don't remember what it stood for, but it's supposed to help people get jobs. We had a bunch of CETA employees with the police department. They hired a bunch of parking control officers. They always civilianized the parking control people, write parking tickets, and hired CETA employees for that because the government gave us money to hire them and some other civilian jobs. So Cork Civella set up something called the Columbus Park, which is what the Little Italy area is formerly called, the Columbus Park Safety and Energy Project. And they basically did nothing. And he got this guy, the Gene Shepard, to kind of set it up and hire all his friends and relatives. And they basically did nothing. He hired people, security consultants, clerks, secretaries, school counselors. And of course, Cork got a kickback from everything. Well, it was during this time the FBI put their microphone in the Villa Capri to pick up Cork and Tuffy Luna talking about Las Vegas. And one thing that Tuffy tells Cork and kind of gives you something about his Nixon penitentiary and tells you about Cork's, his influence here. He says, "Cork, you got to give the guy an answer right now. We got to go find the phone." So they go find the phone, and then we start following Tuffy and find their secret phone and put taps on it. Really opens up that whole casino skimming investigation. But in the meantime, Tuffy is working with Nick, really in a way on his own, but Nick's gotten back out of the penitentiary about this time and working with him on the casino skimming. And Cork's still running everything on the streets. He's the street boss. He's taped reporting to Nick about the ongoing Sparrow problem. He tells Nick that he has a friend that saw Carl Sparrow coming up to the Villa Capri, which is kind of the Civella hangout bar late at night. She saw Carl Sparrow coming up there, peeking in the window, see who was in there. Says, well, we got to do something. And Quirk's complaining, we got guys that aren't doing anything. They got to get off their butts and go do something. They just sitting around doing nothing. And Nick says, well, we've got some guys, and name some old guys. And they talk about hitting Sparrow at the Red Apple Strip Club, which I mentioned before, Anderson's place, because he knows he goes over there because Carl Sparrow has since taken up with Antoinette Langfranca, who was Cork's old girlfriend. Small town here, small town, folks. He said, we got to be cautious. Nick counsels him to be cautious. There's cops everywhere. You almost got caught one time. We never could figure out what that was. Cork agrees, and he speculates the some different guys that might be able to get next to Carl Sparrow. Names off some guys. One of them was like an ex-cop that I do. I remember him early on. He didn't last very long. There's an informant that surfaced. Cork tells Nick that I got guys out looking for him, and then they go back to Carl Sparrow, and Carl's living out in the country, and Cork says, one of our guys, Willie Comisano Jr., he's a big hunter and he's a good shot. He said, get a telescope rifle and shoot Sparrow at his home, which is out in the country. And so they're talking about, sneaking up on the house, and Nick says, none of our guys, they can't run across country like that. And so, but Cork is the guy that's going to be out putting this together. St. Valentine's Day, 1979, we raid all Cork and Nick and Tuffy's houses and take down the casino case. There's a couple more attempts to kill Carl Sparrow during this time, and the third one finally is successful in 1984. Cork is convicted of racketeering in the casino case, and he will die in prison. Cork was a bully. I had a source, a guy I know that's been in that life, around that life his whole life, and grew up over in Little Italy. And he told me a story about Cork. He said in the 1960s, he was at a mob joint, Mel's Pompeii Room out on Main. He was at Mel's Pompeii Room. He had a date. And Cork comes in, sits down at the table without any invitation. He starts flirting with a girl like the guy wasn't even there. The he's kind of a little guy. Of course, Cork ain't the biggest guy in the world as far as, fisticuffs. And Cork says, hey, hold up, man. She's with me. Cork gave him a look, and he said, don't you know who I am? The guy said, yeah, I know, but get the fuck out of here. And Cork just laughed and got up and went to the bar. Cork was an impulsive blowhard, no doubt about it. But he was totally trusted by his brother, and he was feared and respected on the streets. If you're going to do business on the streets, you had some respect and some fear of Cork Civella. He always listened to his older brother, Nick, though. Always listened to him as he would calm him down, and he never went against him. He always took him into consideration if he had to make a decision. So that's kind of the long, he got a 10 to 30 year sentence in 1984, and he dies down in Texas in the federal prison down there. He had a kid. He's had one child, Anthony or Tony Ripe, who will go on to be the boss after Nick dies and Cork goes to prison and Tony Ripe gets back out. Tony Ripe has a bunch of kids. A lot of people in town will say they know Nick Civella's grandson. Well, it's not. It's his grandnephew. Nick Civella did not have children. Cork had one child, Anthony. He married Tuffy Luna's sister, and then he had several children, and none of them really followed the family plan in the mob. So, guys, that's the story of Carl Cork Civella. I hope all you guys have been asking about Kansas City stories. Well, there's another one. I'll make you happy, and I've got more. I just have to get back to them. There's so many stories, and so many stories in so little time, I guess. just talked to a guy on the phone this morning talking about Joe Petrosino, but he wants to talk about the very first mob movie about the Black Hand in 1910, I believe, which was inspired by a case that Joe Petrosino worked on, the Black Hand, and how and the influence of the mafia in movies over the years. So I thought that would be an interesting topic. So I look forward to that. Don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles. Watch out for motorcycles when you're out there. If you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, go to the VA website, get that hotline number. If you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, go see Anthony Ruggiano. He's a Gambino man, and now in witness protection. He's out here living on his own. I don't know what the story is with that. I had him on my show once, but I don't think I asked him. Anyhow, he seemed to be operating okay, and he's a drug and alcohol counselor. He has a hotline, I believe, on his website or his YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to tell your friends about the show and maybe share it on your social media. You know, more people we get, the better I like it. And I got some books and a movie. At least I got one book. I'm working on another one. I got a couple movies out there that are for rent for like $1.99. Gangland Wire and Brothers Against Brothers, the Civella Sparrow War, and my book about the skimming from Las Vegas. And don't forget, if you get the Kindle version, I have the actual wiretaps linked to the book you can listen to. So I guess that's all I got to sell other than myself. And I really appreciate all the comments you make on my YouTube and my Gangland Wire podcast page. And I've gotten to know a lot of you through that. And I really like doing this, and let's just keep doing it for as long as we can. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Thanks.